Hello watercolor lovers, welcome to my YouTube channel Watercolor Impressions. I took this reference while I was waiting for the train in the Toronto subway after 4 years. It brought me a lot of memories, so I thought, let's do a painting of it. As always, I will provide the drawing template and reference. Check the descriptions for the links for downloading drawing template and reference. Before we get on to it, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And let's get started, guys. So whenever I start painting, I'll look for the brightest value in my reference. The brightest value in our reference is that yellow paint on the platform. So I'm using Cadmium Yellow. I'm going to throw a little bit of orange in the foreground so that it creates a beautiful lead-in for our painting. So the next step would be painting the light in our reference. For the floors, I added Cobalt Blue. So I'm thinking all the colors in terms of warm or cool colors. So if it's cool color, I'll go for more on the cooler side. If it's warm, I'm going on the warmer side. But as you can see, we added Cobalt Blue for the floor. And for the walls, I'm using yellow ochre and a little bit of cadmium yellow in it. For the roof, I used raw amber. And as a transition toward the light, I'm going to use a cool color. So I'm using Cobalt Blue for it. And for the lights, which is peeking through in the foreground, let's use Cobalt Blue for it as well, because it's also a cool color as well. It looks bright now. As it dries out, it's gonna get lighter. And you can also see, I also throwing in a bounce light from the platform to a train. Any object that is reflective will have a bounce light that is close to it. It also reflects the color on the surface too. You can see that yellow platform clearly reflects at the bottom of our train. For the main surface of the train, I'm using Payne's gray or neutral tint, and I'm also adding a little bit of cobalt blue in it. But as you can see clearly in the reference, there's a lot of cool colors in it. I'm going to take the neutral tint all over the front part of the train, since there's going to be a lot of darker value in front of our train. Being said that, I'm also making sure and being aware of my eyelids, so I'm leaving my eyelids as well. Now I flip the canvas to silhouette the train to add some darker tones. There is a gradient happening from the background to the foreground, and there's a blue spill also happening in the foreground as well. So I'm being aware of it. I'm just adding darker tones as well. I added cadmium yellow for the other side of the platform, and I'm also going to add the pillars with the darker tones as well. For the darker tones, a mix of French Ultramarine Blue, burnt amber, or Ultramarine Blue and Alizarin Crimson would do the trick. Any colors with neutral tint works too. Being said that, when it comes to darker tones, go with pure pigment. What I mean by that is no water in your brush so that you can get darker value in your painting. For the rails, we can add some warm colors since it reflects the light from the train headlights. We can use cadmium orange or any other warm colors, but to make sure to have a little bit of redness in it. For the top part, a pure pigment of neutral tint would work. I'm also flipping the canvas quite often to get straight lines, to make it easier so that we don't have to fight with our dexterity. Now I started working on building the bit tones at the background. So there was a transitioning happening from the background to the midground with light. So I'm using cadmium yellow and a little bit of Cobalt Turquoise in it so that I can get like a little bit of shadows in at the background. Now let's start working on the figures. For the faces, I'm using burnt sienna with yellow ochre will do the trick. For our focal point, which is the train, let's build the mid-tones. I'm using neutral tint and a lot of cobalt blue to get the coolness of the train in our reference. And you can also see there's a transitioning happening between the front part as well as the side part. So I want to create a softer transition, so I'm using water to get the transition to separate the front and side part. And there is also a darker tone which separates the train and the platform can be added as well. You can use any kind of darker mix I mentioned before. Let's add some quick sharp marks for the details on the side of the train. Then let's add some darker tones. For the darker tones, any kind of pigment, any kind of mix you can do it, unless it's a pure pigment, and make sure to keep it on a cooler side because that's why it's in the reference. And I'm also making sure to leave some highlights for the lights at the top of the train because we're gonna add like a blue lights to it, so it's gonna create a lot of beautiful details on our train. And I'm also adding some details on the pillars on the side of the platform on the other side. And this is the trick I usually use is whenever I add darker pigments, wherever an object anchors, I go super dark on it. So it gives an illusion that it anchors on the ground and where it sits. So as soon as I add that darker details there, it kind of made sense. Now let's focus on the people in the foreground. When you paint figures in your painting, it also tells a story and it also provides scale to your painting as well. Whenever you paint figures, it doesn't have to be exactly true to your reference. Just get the main gesture of it and just add some impression on it. Because the two figures which are in the front, those are the two major figures in our painting. I tend to put more details on them than rest of our figures. Because and our focal point is also the train, so I spend more details on our train than anything else. Let's add some details of the signs which is at the top. So for that I'm just using Payne's Gray and a little bit of Cobalt Blue and French Ultramarine Blue. And I'm not being caught up with the details. Now I'm jumping onto the train. So when I squint my eyes, it looked super weak. So I'm going to glaze over with NeutralTint and where the transition happens. And even the front part of the train, when you squint and see the reference, it has a darker value in there. So I want to make sure to add that, so I'm adding it. Even I'm going darker, I'm being aware of that there's a lights which is in the headlights. I'm adding some darker tones at the bottom of the train. And I squinted my eyes and I noticed that the figure in our foreground looked weak. And since they are in the foreground, I just glazed over it. Now I went on the top part of the detail, and there's a frame which is a little bit kind of different lights in it, so I'm using raw amber and a little bit of NeutralTint in it. And now I'm adding the details in the front part of the train. So that's where we're going to be focusing on adding more details because that's going to be the focal point as well. And since watercolor have this thing, once you paint and it tends to get lighter, don't be scared to build up darker pigments in your watercolor painting because it tends to get lighter. So I usually squint my eyes and check my reference. If there is any darker pigments need to be applied, I'll just go ahead and do it. And you can also see I also worked on the mid part of the train and the front part because it also have a gradient from the mid on to the sides to sides. So I'm keep building up darker pigment on the roof as well as at the pillars as well. So as you can see, I'm being aware of the gradient from the back to the front. As I saw in the reference, the figures in the foreground need to have one more glazing. So whenever I do painting, I'm not afraid of doing the glazing to bring things forward and pushing things backward. So it's part of any painting process, so be aware of that, not be afraid to paint over it and glaze over it. So we're almost at the end of the painting. Now let's add the shadows in the foreground. So the shadows which is peeking through in the foreground has a softer transitioning and the light is peeking through from the top light. So I'm being aware of it, so I create the softer transition, and I also use a lot of cool colors because that's what in our reference. Now I'm squinting my eyes and looking over and adding some more darker pigments and building up the pigments to get the exact value in our reference. Okay, let's add some highlights and details with white paint. You can either use Chinese white or you can also use gouache to add some white paint as well. To make sure that you use pure pigment so you get the pure white pigment in our brush. There's a light which is happening at the top of the train, so I'm using Cobalt Blue and a little bit of white paint and a little bit of gouache in it to get the pigment consistency. And you can also see there's an highlight happening on the right side of the train. I also added that as well. And I squinted my eyes, I saw at the back of the wall which looked super weak and looked super lighter. So I'm going to glaze over it with Cadmium Yellow and a little bit of Cobalt Turquoise to push them back, and match to the value and our reference. Now let's add the lights on the train. There are 3 lights in our train, the one at the bottom and one at the middle. So I'm making sure to add it, and I'm also using cadmium orange and a little bit of yellow in it and a little bit of gouache in it to get the pigment consistency. And now let's add the logo. For the logo I'm using cad red, and I'm also using a little bit of gouache to get the transparency in it. And as you can see, this is the 4th time I'm building up pigment on the front part of a train because our values look weak on it. So I'm keep building up the pigment until I'm happy with the value as it matches to the reference. So we are almost at the end of our painting journey, so I'm going to glaze over wherever it needed. And I'm also using gouache paint and some white paint to bring back some of the eyelets in our painting. And as you can see, I also added eyelets in the platform. And I'm also glazing over the figure in our foreground. She's a major figure, so I'm just glazing over it so that she comes to the front in our painting. So as you can see, I'm also adding a darker pigment on the lights, and I'm also adding some warm colors on our rails and in the foreground as well. Now I want to bring back some of the details on the train which is reflecting from the platform. So I'm taking cadmium yellow and a little bit of gouache in it to get the yellow consistency in our painting. The last thing, I want to finish this painting with some directional lines, so that will help us to get us to lead into the painting. Let's bring some details from the background, and that's it, folks. Thanks for watching this subway / train painting tutorial. Let me know what you learned from this video and what's your favorite color in this painting. If you have any other requests or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, let me know in the comments or write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching this tutorial. Please hit that subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And please do share with your friends and family. And good luck with your painting, folks.